Greetings to you from Chicago, where it is pouring down rain. I'm glad to be with you. And what I want to talk with you today quickly to get into, I want to share with you what the meaning behind otherwise is as we put that next to Bonhoeffer. But in short, we're going to talk about a concept here of an ideal human. The ideal human populating the ideal community. This is really the context of Bonhoeffer's struggle, but he is not alone, and that is not the only space where that happened. Clearly, not the only space. And what did Bonhoeffer's practice in ministry and work as a theologian offer in resistance to that phenomenon that is historically deadly? So as Dr. White mentioned to you, this theme of otherwise, Bonhoeffer otherwise, was born in South Africa. And I'll say a little bit about it here because it's important to what we're doing. It's far too common to locate the problem of Nazi Germany as anti-Semitism, constricting it to hatred over the hatred of Jews. Well, when it's kept in that kind of a small, to miss the way that anti-Semitism is actually a racial problem. Anti-Semitism as a racial issue, which connects it then to European interactions with Africa. When we fail to do that, it's easy to hold or not see, to miss the connection between Nazi Germany and a more broadly construed problem of white supremacy, which may make it easy to not miss, to not pay attention to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So you got on one side, the anti-Semitism problem and just keeping it in your European conversation. On the other side, Bonhoeffer is irrelevant to all these other kinds of things. But what we're doing is paying attention to the multiple layers present inside of Bonhoeffer's history, or the Nazi history of oppression, of genocide, and the practices of resistance against those things, which opens it to a broad array of disciplines today. This is the otherwise. So when Bonhoeffer otherwise, not just the constricted, narrow perspectives that are historical with regards to anti-Semitism, not disregarding him, but otherwise, there's more. There is much more, which opens to a set of disciplines.
Great.
Reggie, we lost you there for a second.
Late historian of racism says that the history of the ideology of human difference. This is telling me that my internet connection is unstable. Please message me if it goes in and out, in and out. That the history of the ideology, okay, I'm frozen here.
You're good now. We can hear you now.
You're back.
You're back.
Okay, good. What did you hear me say last?
What did you catch, Dr. White? He was saying that the history of
the ideology of human difference is really what I'm getting at. There's George Fredrickson, late historian of race from Stanford, said that the ideology of human difference developed into three overtly racist regimes in the 20th century. The Nazi Jim Crow South, the racist Jim Crow South in the United States, Nazi Germany, and apartheid South Africa. All of those links together by a nefarious history, which I begin with because it's really relevant to what we're talking about with Bonhoeffer. Now let me go to sharing my screen here with you. Something I've just learned to do here. And there. Nope, I won't do it that one. I got to do it the other one because you're seeing everything on my screen, which includes my notes. And I kind of keep those like I'm saying it off the top of my head. It helps me feel smart. Okay. Let us do this. Exit slideshow. Okay. Feels like you can hear this rain in the background. It is pouring here. All right, so you're seeing what I'm seeing, right? Okay, you're seeing the slide here of the guy breaking the granite. This picture is from the entrance to Flossenburg, where Dietrich Bonhoeffer was murdered in the morning of April 9th, 1945. The problem of that historical ideology of human difference is what it set up, and what it set up is racism. Racism, white supremacy are both referring to the same phenomenon. I don't make a distinction between the two of them. And that phenomenon is really well understood with reference to this, usually when I'm talking about this, I'll demonstrate this iceberg here. And what is this showing? We all know that when you look at an iceberg, what you can see is on the top of the water. But the bulk of this iceberg is underneath the water. Well, so it is with that nefarious ideology of human difference. What we typically describe as racism is what happens to a person of color in a racist environment. We focus on the person of color who's harmed by that environment. That's a misdirection. It's actually only the secondary effect. It's not the primary effect. What happens, what racism is really all about is what's under the water. What's under the water and unseen is the goal. It's a longing that is the phenomenon of white supremacy. It is the manufacture and the maintenance, the historical manufacture and the ongoing maintenance of systems and structures for whites only. That is what racism and racism is. The manufacture and the maintenance of systems and structures for whites only. That is the iceberg here, all under the water and not seen. So what happens to people of color in racist environments is the effort to keep white space white. And the very bottom of this iceberg here is also unseen, and the fact that it distorts everybody's humanity. Everybody is distorted in that longing. Arno Breker, the sculptor for the Nazis, Hitler loved this man, was renowned for crafting depictions of the ideal human, white, rendered white, and in Nazi Germany rendered specific white for the nation state, the Aryan. The Aryan actually is not, I mean, as it's in its conception, is not a white man. The Aryan points back to the Vedic period in Iranian, India, geographical region of the Middle East, 530 BCE. As an ethnic group from that era that's been packed in contemporary 20th century with local nationalist meaning, referring to or actually drawing on what they had in Nazi Germany as this discipline called raceology. In the United States, we have eugenics. Raceology and eugenics were basically about the same thing. They were developing these schools of thought simultaneously, which shows how the practice of white supremacy actually stemming from given maturity during the transatlantic slave trade from a history of philosophy and science all comes together. That the practice of purifying the race or of idolizing an ideal type, racial type, is a long-standing one over a few hundred years, actually developing its maturity during the slave trade. Arnold Brecker is painting a locally construed version of this idealized figure, the Aryan. That's the national structure in Nazi Germany. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer is actually a very good representation of this idealized type. And the nation state in Nazi Germany was actually being built for him in the manufacture and the maintenance of systems and structures for whites only, and the local rendition of that around the Aryan. Now, what happens when they're doing that, building something for whites only, white becomes almost an invisible moving structure building this. What they focus on is the unwanted ones. They're targeted. And here, this depiction of the eternal Jew is actually, those of you who may know of Goebbels' work, this is a popular movie during the Nazi era, and an awful piece of propaganda about Jews. The eternal Jew is a figure cursed to roam the countryside, never to die as a result of killing the Savior. That's Polish here. This one here, the Jew, warmonger, war prolonger. This is related to the theory that the Jews were the reason for the Nazis, for the Germany losing the war. They are hated and despised. And if I had time, I would go through the same kind of caricatures made in the United States around Black people, with the Uncle Tom and the Mammy and the Sleepin' Eat and the Pickaninny and so forth. So these depictions, this propaganda showing or filling the nation with a targeted, hated people. This piece of artwork here from September of 1930, the Reichstag election, summarizes Nazi ideology in a single image. Nazi sword kills a snake and the blade is passing through a red Star of David. The words coming from the snake usually are interest. Versailles, where a bit of national legislation was passed blaming Germany for World War I. Unemployment, war guilt, the lie of war guilt being placed on Germany, so forth. It's all of these words coming out of that snake that the Nazi sword is killing. So all these things here, I point to this to give a foundation for what's happening when Bonhoeffer is both trained to be a theologian, and this piece here, this propaganda with the sword and the snake was popularized while he was in New York. He comes to New York, age 24, after being trained as a theologian and finishing 2 dissertations. By his 24th birthday, 2 dissertations. I want to highlight that, 2. And he's got a position as a professor at the local, at Berlin University, at the university in Berlin, before he's 25 years old. He's too young to be ordained. So he comes to New York to see the world a bit and to learn English better. New York is specifically the place where he chooses not because of Union Seminary, sorry, Andrea, not because of Union Seminary, but because of the broader possibilities of learning outside of Union. He doesn't like the idea of being under obligatory professors with obligatory textbooks and assignments and so forth. He uses New York as a school. He was attending Riverside Church as well, but Abyssinian became his church home. And he's not as in touch with the problem of race when he gets there. It's what happens by learning in Harlem that alerts him to this ideology as racist and the nefarious nature of it as racism. So these next few slides show, I want to introduce you to his final days of life, starting with this question that I'll have here for you. Bonhoeffer is an enemy of the state by choice. As I've just shown to you, there's this racist ideology that's animating the Nazi state. They want an Aryans-only nation. They want a nation, an ideal community, populated with an ideal human type. That's what they want. And to go after that ideal type, they need to show why the ideal is elite and better than any and everything else. To do that, they attach ideology to the unwanted ones, to show them as contagions to the community that is pure and ideal. Let me go back to this Arnold Brecker one, and I'm going to read you something from Mein Kampf related to this. This is what Hitler is talking about with regards to this figure. In this world, in the earth, human culture and civilization are inseparably bound up with the Aryan. He who dares lay a hand upon the highest image of the Lord sins against the benevolent creator of this miracle and helps in the expulsion from paradise. Hitler's words. Civilization and culture are tied up with this ideal type. He is the highest image of the Lord. And whoever touches him, meaning touches the womb, makes him impure, sins against the highest image of the Lord, and aids in the expulsion from paradise, which is reference to the original sin. All right, I'm going to move quicker here so that I can get through majority of these slides. I may have to stop part way through them. Now, getting to Bonhoeffer, I want to ask these questions. How was Bonhoeffer's understanding of God and God's work in the world connected to his eventual death in opposition to these people? What did Bonhoeffer understand about the times that he lived in? And what do we learn from his response? Now the second question is all the more important. It's all the more important because very early on, Bonhoeffer saw these racial issues as a problem when most others did not in Germany. How did he gain that insight? How did he see this? And he was very radical in his opposition to the Nazis. As early as 1933, he expected to be going to a concentration camp. That's when Dachau was invented. He expected to be going in 1933, which leads to this final question here. And I want to qualify that the question is not who killed Bonhoeffer. We know that it was the Nazis, but what killed Bonhoeffer? The Nazis themselves were informed by an ideology that predated them. What killed Bonhoeffer? Okay. So here's some information for you with some pictures to see. Bonhoeffer is arrested in 1944, April 5th, in his parents' house. He's arrested and he's taken to a prison in Tegel in Berlin. And there's this guy, whoa, let me go back here. Look at this guy sitting at Bonhoeffer's desk in his parents' house. I'm acting like I'm reading. His sister is right next door. His sister's house is next door. This is his bedroom. April 5th, 1945, Hitler orders the liquidation of a resistance group, the military intelligence, which is kind of a German version of the CIA. They gathered intelligence against the enemies and so forth and passed them on to Nazis. Bonhoeffer worked for the Abwehr. April 6th, He's mistakenly taken to a prison about an hour and a half drive from Flossenburg, where he thinks he's escaped. He gives an Easter homily, and right after the Easter homily, he gets a knock on the door, asking him to gather his things, and he knew that that meant death. On April 8th, he arrives at the concentration camp. Quick fake trial is put together, and he's sentenced to death along with several other conspirators who were there. And on the morning of April 9th, 1945, he's hanged at Flossenburg concentration camp. He was 39 years old. 39. April 9th, 1945. He lived 5 days longer, 5 days, than Martin Luther King Jr., who was also killed in April of his 39th birthday. Malcolm X was also killed at 39 at age 39. Two interesting correlations. This is what's left of Flossenburg concentration camp. Bonhoeffer was killed in the courtyard there. And this is what the cell would have looked like that he was held in. That's the actual cell at Flossenburg now. People like looking at pictures, so I'm showing you these, but I'm going to move quickly through them. This is where they have a monument to the bones and ashes of people killed there. It's in this valley of death at Flossenburg that where his ashes are. So he was planning on or expecting death. And ironically, he represented the figure for whom the Nazis were building a nation state. Yet he became a traitor to that exact nation state. How is that? When he was arrested, and after the coup attempt failed, that his group was part of. If you've seen the movie Operation Valkyrie with Tom Cruise, you've witnessed the failure of the coup attempt that Bonhoeffer group was a part of. They were actually a part of several coup attempts, but this final one here was the one that did them in. Bonhoeffer was already imprisoned. After he learned that the coup attempt failed, he turns towards writing theology in prison. And by the way, there's a book that contains the letters. Many of you may know about it, Letters and Papers from Prison, his correspondence with his friend. He starts writing theology, and he outlines a book. In the book, he asks this question: what do we believe? What do we really believe? I mean, believe in such a way that our lives depend on it. And then he makes this statement: the church is the church only when it is there for others. At this point, when we get into his understanding of theology and of being Christian, that ends up being oppositional to the Nazis, we enter into something that is core for what he did before coming to New York as a theologian. It's core to what he put together as a theologian, but he didn't recognize the significance of it or its broad range until he goes through Harlem. When he says the church is the church only when it is there for others, he's actually talking about the bulk of his theological project. Now, I am making a connection to his theological project. I'm making a connection to the ideology that killed him, Jewish people, enslaved Africans, and set up overtly racist regimes. That ideology was necessarily connected to people of African descent as they move through this door of no return. This is in a slave castle in Ghana. Okay. This turns the world in on a particular type of community. This community is not there for others. They don't have the capacity, using Bonhoeffer's theology. They are there for themselves, for a type. I'm going to move quickly here. Now, to be there for others, Bonhoeffer builds his theology in several different moves. Keep in mind, being for others. He does several things. He's first lodges an attack on Europe's history of philosophy. Philosophically, they make a distinction between human and person. The material that they might say that what's being put together in a woman's womb when she's pregnant is human. When it's born, it's human. At the very end of our lives, you're human, even though you may have dementia and can't really tell where you're at. You're human. But they might say that there's no personhood there. Personhood is found in capacities, what Peter Singer from Princeton calls actualities. An enclosed rational mind can translate thought into speech, can state wishes for the future, hopes for the fears for the future, and so forth, regrets, and so on. An enclosed rational mind, self-aware. But Bonhoeffer wants to move it from this individual enclosed rational mind into social interaction. That we know from roles, like I'm a husband because I have a wife. My wife's on this call too, by the way. I'm a teacher when I have professors. I mean, I'm a professor when I have students. I'm a father because I have kids. These are social roles, but they also point to the fact that without the people there is no me. There's no person. It's a social thing, not an enclosed rational mind, first. Second, it's also corporate. A group has its own personality. The person of Riverside Church is different from the person of another church. The person of Union Seminary is different from the person of New York Theological Seminary. The people within that group shape the ethos of the community, and the community shapes the people. That makes a person. Okay? Ask me questions about this because I'm moving through it quickly, and forgive me if I'm turning on a fire hose of information. That objective, that ethos is the mind of the collective person here. Now, Christ becomes the collective person of a new humanity. So let me move this again. Person is both individual and it's corporate in social interaction, not in reason. It's both individual and it's collective. He does this because he wants to describe Christ as the collective person of a new humanity. The new humanity is now only found in Christ, which is really a reference to all of human beings. Christ, this is Bonhoeffer's term, what he uses the phrase Stellvertretung. Now, quickly, as the new Adam, Jesus is new human being. The new human. He stands in for all of humanity. We in our sin and shame cannot stand before God. Christ stands in for us and is human being for all of us before God. So what this means is whenever you encounter a human being, wherever they are, in the church or out of the church, you're always having an encounter with Jesus. But the church in the world is the present manifestation of that new humanity. It doesn't mean that the church is the only new humanity, is the only representation of Christ, because you have an encounter with Christ when you meet anyone. What this does is it reconnects us with God and us with our neighbor. That's what Stellvertretung is. Let me stop there and check in, because I've just thrown a whole lot at you. But it's important to know this foundational piece when talking about the problem of the ideal human. Let's take a couple of seconds here for questions. And while I'm sharing the screen, I can't tell if I can't see the chat happening.
So friends, it would be best if you would raise your hand so we can, Dr. Williams can see in the participants tab who has a question. And you can ask your question live, or if you want to type it in the chat, that is fine too, and we can read it for you.
Yeah, let's just take a few questions here because I know we're running short on time. Let me just.
There's a question from Merv.
Okay, Merv, go ahead.
I have a very trite matter. They say a person's name is the most important word in any language. And if in this class we could focus on saying Bonhoeffer instead of Bonhoeffer, those are two different names.
Yes, that is trite.
Forgive me, but it's very important. It's very, very important.
I get you. I get you. You don't like my American accent?
No, it's not you. Okay. It's other people too. People are mispronouncing the name.
No, I get you. Thank
a big
you.
Difference. I'm a German scholar. That's why I say it.
I appreciate the German scholar. Now let's move. Any other questions? Right, Susan. Yes.
This might be going a different direction, but as I was sitting listening to you breaking down words about personhood and relationship, I was thinking about the concept of Ubuntu. How a person is the person.
That's actually not going a different direction. That's actually you're tracking with me when I'm trying to do this. See, what Bonhoeffer is doing is confronting a community that's been structured by the Enlightenment. But in South Africa and in West Africa, you're talking about communities not structured in their understanding of person by the Enlightenment. So Ubuntu, meaning persons are persons through persons, or I am because we are, is that social understanding of my identity. And in Ghana, they have a similar phrase, miye efise yeye. It means the same thing amongst the Twi. I am because we are. And which is interesting to say that you raised that, because when Bonhoeffer's theology and witness against the Nazis makes it to South Africa, they're like, for many of the blacks, they're fighting the apartheid regime. They're like, this is not so new to us. Was there one more hand?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. This is Elvin Montgomery. I have a question. The fact that Bonhoeffer visited Harlem and the Black church has been mentioned several times.
Yes.
What exactly did he learn from them? What was the influence from them that he got and incorporated into his work?
So if you can hold on to that for one moment, because we're moving we're moving into that. I want to make sure that you're tracking with me on this concept of personhood, because when he understands, when he's trying to move person from actualities and potential for the enclosed rational mind, he moves it into a social sphere. Personhood is only person because other persons are there. I can only be person in relationship, not in my enclosed mind. And what that does, it's tracking with this concept of freedom that Bonhoeffer's got. It's very Lutheran. Freedom is only describing my ability to relate. It's being for others, the heart turned towards others, as opposed to the heart turned in on itself. The enclosed rational mind, understanding my personhood and my ability to reason, can treat an other person as an object. I meet you and I know more about me in that encounter with you. That's the history of race. By the way, that's the history of race. Encounters with Africans only sets up for white people, white as ascendant, by the way they describe others. That is not an actual encounter with them. Their hearts are not turned towards others, not being receptive of the humanity that's before them, as that humanity describes itself to the others. Okay, so personhood is a social category, but it was really localized for Bonhoeffer until he moves in to the Harlem community and starts encountering concepts of God with us amongst Black people. At Abyssinian and in the Harlem Renaissance, he meets a community that has its entire person under the gospel. And what is that? What do I mean by that? In Germany, one of the things that he was hoping to do was reform the church, because Christianity was just a cultural practice. You have church where you get married, you do catechism, it's a part of the upper crust elite culture. Not really referencing society beyond cultural practices, what's called Protestant culture, or Protestantism. And then he moves into Harlem, comes into Harlem, and an Abyssinian Baptist, and even amongst the people of the Harlem Renaissance, scholars amongst the Harlem Renaissance, more specifically at at Abyssinian Baptist, being a Christian involves your entire being. How could it not? When for this history of Black Christianity, my entire being is affirmed in Christ, not denigrated like it is in society. Like this painting here demonstrates from Aaron Douglas, the most prominent artist, one of the most prominent artists of the Harlem Renaissance, is depicting something he would have heard at Abyssinian. Now in this painting, I asked the question, where is Jesus? And because I asked that question, most people then they turn to say, oh, okay, he's not carrying the cross. But it would make sense that you would see him carrying the cross. Where is Jesus? Jesus is here. Okay, who is this? This is the fifth station of the cross. That's Simon of Cyrene, that's Black Simon. As the saying goes, or this legend, this understanding of the crucifixion goes, it's tradition. When Simon picked up the cross, Black people picked up the suffering of Jesus. Simon, Cyrene, North Africa, Black people. Simon's Black body touched that cross, Black people got associated with the suffering of Christ. What does that say for the people who inflict Black suffering? They are complicit also in the crucifixion of Christ. I grew up actually knowing this tradition. It was this from Palmer Hayden, Jesus and the Three Marys. Think of Arnold Brecker's sculpture of the ideal human. When you look at these disproportionate bodies, dark, large, proletariat working class hands, and a body on the cross, and here the women standing next to him, as opposed to some depictions of Jesus that you get from the 18th century with perfectly proportioned white blonde women kneeling at the feet of one risen with all power. Here they're connecting with Christ in Christ's suffering. The connection in suffering is something that Bonhoeffer becomes familiar with even more so as a result of his time with Black Christians in Harlem. Their entire person, not compartmentalized Christianity, their entire person under the gospel and a connection to Christ in suffering, turning towards Jesus in a concrete sense of identification with Jesus. These are themes that turn him away from what he would say a more academic, abstract interaction with theology into personal faith. This is what happens to him in New York. He becomes a Christian. And he hears this sermon from, this is a portion of a sermon that Adam Clayton Powell Sr. preached while he was there, while he's attending Union and Abyssinian Baptist. So keep in mind the concept of the collective person. When we encounter Christ, when we encounter a human being, we always encounter Christ. Powell says in this sermon, we clothe God by clothing men and women. Jesus interpreted this as a command to clothe men and women when they are naked. When you give men and women coats, shoes, and dresses, you're giving clothes to God. If the Bible does not mean this, it does not mean anything. Men need sympathy, but just as men cannot live on bread alone, they cannot live on sympathy alone. We clothe God by clothing men and women. When you have an encounter with another human being, you are having an encounter with the Christ who was present in the world. This is the gospel. This would have made sense to the Christ-centered theologian of Stellvertretung. When he returns to Germany, he makes these statements here in a catechism that he writes with a Jewish friend of his. God has arranged it so that all races of humanity of the earth come from one blood. He would have read this in Du Bois, which, by the way, he read Du Bois, and wrote an essay on these Harlem Renaissance scholars. Therefore, defiant ethnic pride. Now, what do you mean? How would you interpret ethnic pride? Might say whites only. Because in 1931, as I showed you that poster, the Nazi ideology is picking up steam. A defiant ethnic pride is a sin against the Holy Spirit, the unpardonable sin. Here we see for him, at this point, he's recognizing racism as a Christian problem. It shuts down your ability to be for your neighbor and cuts off the work of God in the world. As much as the Christian, this is also in that catechism, as much as the Christian would like to remain distant from political struggle, nonetheless, even here, the commandment of love urges the Christian to stand up for his neighbor. His faith and love must know whether the dictates of the state may lead him against his conscience. Now, what is this for a German Lutheran scholar to be saying a Christian must act politically? You have no more compartmentalization here. Here he's arguing that the Christian must act political in the context of the state harming your neighbor. And this is around racism. These are imported goods. The summer he comes back from New York, he writes this. Now, a couple more pieces here. The church struggle kicks up roughly about 1933 when Hitler becomes Reich Chancellor. You have this group called the German Christians. Now, it may seem like that's just, Germans who are Christian, but it's not. The German Christians are really a racist group that wants to collapse the Nazi project inside of the mission of the church. Hitler and the Nazis pick up on this kind of practice that actually started in 1932. And they become friendly, very friendly towards the Nazi project. So much so that when the Nazis passed this law for the reconstruction of civil service, that's not its actual name, but when they passed this in 1933, the Nazi Christians want to synchronize, the German Christians want to synchronize all of civil and social services and practices, the church was included in this, under the leadership of the Fuhrer, in this practice of the Fuhrer principle. Synchronization of the Fuhrer principle. This includes the church. The church struggle is about keeping those separate. What becomes the confessing church in 1935 starts off as a different group in 1933, and they're pushing back against the Nazis. Now, in 1933, this is important because without Christian support, there is no there is no Hitler in power in Nazi Germany. Without Christian support, you don't get Nazis having the power that they will have in 1939 at the outbreak of the war. It doesn't happen. This picture here, I took at the church in Germany where the Barmen Declaration that develops the Confessing Church movement, it's their piece of literature that describes their theology, was signed, written by Karl Barth in 1935 while the Lutherans slept, he said. This piece here shows Hitler, hat in hand, standing under a cross, a really good piece of propaganda showing how Christian the man is. Without Christian support, there is no Nazi Germany. And it's this Christian support that gives us this hope for an ideal community populated with an ideal type. This is the longing that sets in place the murder of millions. It is this sovereign, self-possessed, beautiful, rational, ideal figure that gives us a template by which to police the borders and the boundaries of ideal. Bonhoeffer describes personhood as social and an encounter with Christ. Christ mediates the conversation or the contact that we have with anybody, anywhere, all the time, and mandates and requests that we are open for others, as opposed to enclosed rational minds set on an ideal that we have in our minds for what human beings or what personhood is. Yet he comes through New York. I mean, Bonhoeffer comes through New York and is troubled. And this trouble sets for him a different perspective. This perspective, he writes in 1942, near the end, I mean, at the end, the church struggle has now failed. It's all imploded. They've given in to the Nazis, majority of them to the Nazis. He's got only a small group. This is to a group of friends. He writes this in a piece called After 10 Years. The church struggle really had been going on because it starts with a certain small set of people in 32, in 32, but blows in, it comes the full church struggle in 33. But after 10 years in 42, he writes this letter. And in this letter, he includes this statement: "It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below." This is socially constructed, from below, the bottom of the hierarchy of human being, from below, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, and the reviled. In short, from the perspective of suffering, that we come to see matters great and small, happiness and misfortune, strength and weakness with new eyes, that our sense for greatness, for humanness, for justice and mercy has grown clearer, freer, more incorruptible, that we learn indeed that personal suffering is a more useful key and more fruitful principle than personal happiness for exploring the meaning of the world in contemplation and action. What does he mean by this? That we should harm ourselves so that we can see clearer? No, that's not what he's referring to. He's making the claim that you see the ideal nature, the goodness of your community, not from the perspective of the Aryan, but from the perspective of the Jew, or the Black, or the queer, whomever that may be, who is not among the ideal in your community, not from those who are comfortable within the grip of power that is manufacturing, that is maintaining systems and structures for whites only, but from those who are harmed within the community that you call good. That's how you know the benevolence of your community, the worth of your community. So I'll end here with this. And I'm gonna go on ahead and apologize to our German scholar. My German accent is awful. So I'm sorry. How was Bonhoeffer's understanding of God and God's work in the world connected to his eventual death? This is the way we started. What did Bonhoeffer understand about the times that he lived in, and what did we learn from his response? Not who, but what killed Bonhoeffer. I leave these here now for conversation, and I think we have like 3 minutes. I'm sorry. But let me just offer a quick response to them. Bonhoeffer was trying to be Christian. That was it. And his understanding of being free for others led to that. We could not turn a blind eye when we recognize that there are people being killed. First. And his understanding of the times that he lived in from his response was that this demands, I mean, the church is the church only when it's there for others, and without political resistance against a community or a governmental structure that is for others, we can't call ourselves the church. Secondly, and it was that harmful racist ideology that we are addressing, that harmful ideology of race, of idealized human, which is masculine, heterosexual, sovereign and self-possessed, patriarchal, that we have today, and has gotten segments of society really excited about building that wall. I'll leave you there.